The land stretched endlessly, a wild, sunburned horizon painted in shades of gold and dust. The Old West was a place of contradictions, harsh yet breathtaking, merciless yet alive with quiet beauty. Rolling plains shimmered under a ruthless sun, and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant rain. Life here demanded resilience, not just from the body but from the spirit. Every mile of land was hard won. Every drop of water a small miracle dot. It was in this unforgiving country that Elias Turner and Sarah Whitlock first crossed paths. Elias was a man of few words, a rugged rancher, whose silence spoke louder than most men's sermons. The years had etched deep lines into his sun-browned skin, and his eyes held the wary calm of a man who'd seen too much. His land, though modest, was everything he had left, a patch of stubborn green carved from wilderness. Sustained by grit and sheer will. Sarah, by contrast, was a recent arrival. A woman from the East, she carried herself with quiet composure, though the dust and wind had already begun to test her resolve. She'd come west seeking opportunity, a teaching post in a small frontier settlement that had more horses than children. Her journey had been long and lonely, marked by loss and necessity. Beneath her calm exterior lay exhaustion and the ache of someone searching for belonging. When she met Elias, it wasn't under kind circumstances. She'd been traveling alone, her wagon creaking beneath the weight of her belongings and her dwindling optimism. The trail had grown rough, the air thick with heat and tension. She hadn't noticed the dark band of clouds forming low on the horizon until it was too late. Elias had. He'd been repairing a broken fence post when the light began to change, that eerie stillness that comes before a storm. The wind fell silent, the air grew heavy, and then the sky darkened to a bruised purple. The signs were unmistakable. A dust storm was coming, fast and mean. When he spotted her wagon in the distance, heading straight into its path, instinct overrode his solitude. He mounted his horse and rode hard. Sarah didn't see him until he was almost upon her, a lone figure emerging from the gathering haze. "You need to turn back," he shouted over the rising wind. At first, she resisted. She wasn't used to being told what to do, least of all by a stranger. But when she turned and saw the wall of dust rolling toward them, a living, roaring force that devoured sky and sun alike, her pride gave way to fear. He guided her toward a rocky outcrop, where they took shelter behind a boulder as the storm hit. The world went mad. The air turned black with dust, howling wind tearing at their clothes and hair. The ground trembled beneath the force of it. Sarah huddled close, eyes stinging, breath caught between panic and awe. Elias shielded her as best he could, his hat pulled low, his arms steady around her shoulders. For endless minutes, they could do nothing but endure. When at last the storm began to fade, the two of them emerged coated in grit, their clothes heavy with sand and silence. The world lay changed, the horizon obscured, the trail erased, the air still thick with aftermath. Sarah looked at him, her face streaked with dust, and whispered, "Thank you." He tipped his hat. "Don't thank me yet, ma'am. We're not out of it." Though neither realized it then, that storm, both literal and symbolic, was more than just a clash of wind and earth. It was the beginning of something neither of them expected, for just as the wild frontier tested the strength of every pioneer who crossed it, so too would it test the boundaries of their hearts. The dust storm had not only stripped the land bare, it had exposed something fragile and untamed between them, the first flicker of connection in a world where trust was as rare as rain. And as the wind died and the silence returned, Elias and Sarah found themselves standing together on the edge of an unmapped frontier, the one inside themselves. The first roar of the dust storm hit like a cannon, blast a low, thunderous growl that swallowed the horizon whole. One moment, Elias and Sarah were riding side by side, their horses uneasy beneath them. The next, the world vanished into a violent sea of red-brown haze. The air thickened until it was impossible to breathe without choking. Wind screamed through the canyon, whipping sand and grit into their eyes, their skin, their lungs. "Sarah!" Elias shouted, his voice instantly lost to the storm's fury. She turned toward the sound, but the wind snatched her response away. The world had become nothing but motion, soundless except for the unending howl, sightless except for the swirling dust that blinded her. Panic took hold. She clutched the reins, but her horse reared, terrified, and bolted into the storm. Within seconds, Elias was gone. That separation, swift, absolute, merciless, mirrored the isolation each of them had carried long before the storm hit. For years, both had lived apart from others in their own way. Elias, haunted by the loss of his family and the harsh solitude of ranch life, had built walls around himself as thick as any canyon. Sarah, orphaned young and shaped by survival in an indifferent world, had learned not to depend on anyone but herself. Now, as the storm swallowed them whole, those walls offered no protection. Sarah's horse stumbled, nearly throwing her. She hit the ground hard, her palms scraping over the dry, cracked earth. The air was thick and unbreathable. She pulled her shawl over her mouth, tears of pain and grit streaking her cheeks. She couldn't see more than a foot ahead. The sky, the ground, even her own hands seemed to dissolve into the storm's embrace. Each breath burned. Each step felt like walking through smoke. Still, she forced herself onward. One hand stretched in front of her, reaching for anything solid, a tree, a rock, a voice. But all she found was the storm's relentless song, an endless, battering rhythm that stripped the world of direction and sound. Elias, meanwhile, fought his own battle. His horse had fled, and he trudged through the swirling dust, blind and half suffocated. Every instinct screamed for him to find cover, but a stronger instinct, one he couldn't explain, drove him to find her. "Sarah!" He shouted again, his voice raw. No answer came, only the storm's mocking echo. He crouched low, remembering an old rancher's wisdom. When you can't see, you listen. When you can't move forward, feel your way home. Closing his eyes, sight now useless, he focused on other senses. The faint direction of the wind, the texture of the ground, the echo of distant movement. Somewhere deep within the chaos, he thought he heard her cough. Sarah, too, began to rely on instinct more than logic. The world was stripped down to its most primal elements: sound, touch, heartbeat. When she stumbled against a rock face, she pressed herself against it, grounding her trembling body. The storm roared, but her senses sharpened within that darkness. She could feel the direction of the wind, hear the faint neigh of a distant horse. Sense, impossibly, that she wasn't alone. It wasn't words or vision that guided her. It was connection, fragile and unseen. For a long, harrowing hour, both of them fought separately against the same raging storm, tethered only by that invisible thread. They could not see each other, could not call out through the wind, but somehow both kept moving in the same direction. When the storm finally began to break, the silence that followed was deafening. The wind softened into a ghostly whisper, the dust settling like ash after fire. Sarah lifted her head, blinking through the haze, and saw, through the fading veil, the outline of a man staggering toward her. Elias. They met wordlessly, breathless and coated in dust, eyes wide with disbelief and relief. The first thing he did was reach for her, gripping her shoulders as if to make sure she was real. "You're alive," he said, voice cracking. "So are you," she replied, and despite the exhaustion, a faint smile trembled on her lips. That moment, fragile, born from chaos, was more than survival. It was the first spark of trust. In the blindness of the storm, they had learned to see differently. Not with their eyes, but with their instincts. Not with certainty, but with faith. And though the storm had left the land scarred and barren, it had also cleared something within them, revealing two souls who, against all odds, had found each other in the dark. The storm had not ended, it had only softened, as though the land itself had grown tired of its own fury. The air was still thick with dust, and visibility remained a pale blur. But somewhere amid that muted chaos, the world had quieted just enough for hope to whisper through. Elias leaned against the jagged edge of a boulder, his face streaked with grime, lungs burning from grit and exhaustion. Every breath felt heavy, but the silence between gusts drew him upright again. The wind no longer howled, it sighed. And in that sigh, he thought he heard something, a faint, almost delicate sound carried on the breeze. Elias. It was so soft he might have imagined it. But to a man who'd spent most of his life alone, that one fragile sound struck like thunder. "Sarah!" he shouted, his voice rough, echoing off the unseen cliffs. Nothing for a long moment, only the wind. Then, faintly, as though from far away, came an answering call. They began to move toward one another, step by cautious step, guided by nothing but sound and instinct. The storm had stolen their sight, their bearings, even their sense of direction, but it could not erase the human drive to connect between the lulls of wind. Elias would call her name, then stop and listen. Sarah would answer in short bursts, conserving her breath. They began to use landmarks to orient themselves: the split rock, the fallen tree, the river's curve, but even those words felt uncertain in the haze. Still, it was enough. Enough to remind them that someone else was out there, fighting the same battle as they shouted across the storm's remnants. Something deeper began to take shape. A bond forged not through sight or comfort, but through shared vulnerability. Sarah had always prided herself on her independence. The frontier demanded it. She had survived by keeping her emotions buried beneath the same layers of grit that covered her skin. But in the emptiness of the storm, she found herself speaking, not just shouting for rescue, but confessing to the wind. "I used to hate the silence," she murmured once, voice trembling, "but now it's all I have to hear you." Elias, too, found himself shedding the layers of stoicism he'd built over years of solitude. The storm had stripped him bare of pride, of control, of certainty. When he heard her voice faintly answer him in the distance, something inside him softened. It wasn't just relief, it was recognition. In their isolation, they became more honest than they'd ever been in company. He began to tell her about his ranch, the land he'd nearly lost, the wife he'd buried, the loneliness that had followed like a shadow he couldn't shake. She, in turn, spoke of her years drifting between settlements, teaching where she could, always leaving before she could be left behind. They couldn't see each other's faces, couldn't offer the comfort of a hand or a smile, but their voices became the lifeline between them, fragile yet constant. Every call, every echo carried more than words. It carried faith. And slowly, something miraculous happened. As the storm's density began to lift, and the first fragments of light pierced the brown haze, both found themselves pausing not from exhaustion, but from awe. For the first time in what felt like forever, they were not afraid of being lost. In that blindness, they had learned to see differently, to sense kindness, courage, and compassion without needing to look. When finally they caught a glimpse of each other again, a dim silhouette through the thinning dust, it felt almost sacred. Elias's outline was faint but steady. Sarah's was small yet unyielding. They didn't rush toward each other. They stood still for a moment, simply listening to the wind, to the quiet between them, to the new understanding that had been born from fear. The storm had stripped away all illusion, all pretense. What remained were two people flawed, raw, and unguarded, seeing each other not as strangers, but as souls laid bare. Elias took a slow step forward, his voice low but sure. "You kept me going," he said simply. Sarah smiled, though her lips trembled. "No," she whispered back. "You did the same for me." And as the wind finally began to die down completely, leaving only silence and the faint scent of rain on the air, both realized that what had begun as a fight for survival had become something else entirely, a conversation between hearts that didn't need sight or even words to understand one another. They had been blinded by the storm, but now they could finally see not just the world around them, but the truth within themselves. When the storm at last began to die, it wasn't sudden. It withdrew like a wild animal, reluctant to surrender its hold. The wind's roar softened into a whisper, the thick red-brown haze thinning until slivers of pale sunlight pierced through. Dust settled over the landscape like a shroud of gold, coating every rock, cactus, and broken wagon wheel in a strange, ethereal light. The world was no longer wild and raging. It was eerily still, transformed. Elias lifted his head first. His lungs burned, his eyes stung, and his throat felt like sandpaper. But in the silence that followed the storm, he could hear his own heartbeat. And beneath it, faint, wavering, but real, came a sound that pulled him back from despair. "Elias?" Her voice. He turned toward it instinctively, blinking through the dusty fog. At first, all he could make out were shifting shapes, the ground a blur of motionless brown. Then, as the sunlight cut deeper through the haze, he saw it, the outline of a woman stumbling toward him, arms half raised to shield her face. For a moment, he didn't trust his eyes. After so many hours of blindness and chaos, he feared this was another illusion, some cruel mirage born of exhaustion. But then she called his name again, louder this time. Her voice cracked but alive, and Elias began to run. They met in the middle of the wasteland, two dust-covered figures in a world remade. Sarah nearly collapsed into him, her body trembling from cold and exhaustion. He caught her in his arms, steadying her, holding her close as if to anchor them both in the reality of that moment. For several long seconds, neither spoke. The silence between them was not empty, it was sacred. The wind still murmured faintly, carrying the scent of rain and earth, but to them, it felt as if the whole world had gone still to witness their reunion. When Sarah finally pulled back enough to look at him, she gasped softly. The man before her was no longer the composed stranger she had first met, but someone changed. His face streaked with dirt, his eyes raw with emotion, his every line etched with survival and care. And she realized she must look the same, not polished or proper, but real. "You found me," she whispered. "I never stopped trying," he answered, voice low but steady. In that instant, something profound passed between them, something beyond gratitude, beyond relief. It was the recognition of a bond forged in blindness, tested in fear, and revealed only now that the light had returned. They sank down together on a patch of earth, still damp from the storm's passing, leaning against one another for strength. Around them, the world glittered strangely, sunlight glancing off dust particles like tiny embers. The devastation was clear. Broken branches, scattered stones, trails erased. Yet amid the ruin, there was a strange kind of beauty, renewal after chaos. Elias looked at the horizon, where the first clear line of sky had emerged, brilliant blue against the golden haze. "It's strange," he murmured. "We were blind for so long. But I think that's when I really saw you." Sarah turned her head toward him, her eyes reflecting the fragile light. "Maybe that's how it works," she said softly. "Sometimes you have to lose the world to find what matters." They didn't need to speak much after that. The connection between them, born not from sight, but from survival and shared fear, pulsed quietly in the space between heartbeats. The storm had tested them, stripped away everything unnecessary, and left only the truth of who they were. Elias reached out, brushing a streak of dust from her cheek with a gentleness that surprised them both. The gesture wasn't just affection. It was acknowledgement. They had seen each other's strength, their fear, their will to survive. What they found in each other wasn't perfection. It was understanding. As the last of the storm clouds drifted away and sunlight poured freely across the land, they both looked around at the vast, scarred, yet breathtaking expanse of the frontier. What had once been a place of isolation now felt like something entirely different, the beginning of something neither of them had expected. Hand in hand, they stood, facing a horizon reborn. In the end, the dust storm had done more than test them, it had revealed them. Their bond was not built in calm or clarity, but in blindness, struggle, and the willingness to trust the unseen. And as the wind quieted into a tender breeze, the same wind that had once screamed through the canyon, it carried their unspoken truth across the open land. Love, like the frontier, was wild, untamed, and enduring. And in the heart of the storm, they had finally found it. The storm had passed, but its echo lived on, in the stillness of the land, in the lingering haze that hung low across the horizon, and in the quiet rhythm of two hearts that had survived it together. The world, once violent and chaotic, was now painted in soft golds and silvers, as if nature itself were catching its breath. Elias and Sarah stood at the edge of a shallow ravine, the ground beneath their boots still damp from the rare desert rain. The silence felt vast, not empty, but alive. It was in that silence that the truth of what had happened between them began to unfold. Adversity had a way of stripping people down to their truest selves. The dust storm had taken nearly everything from them: sight, direction, control, but in doing so, it had also peeled away the layers they had built to protect themselves from the world. The man who had once spoken little and lived only for the rhythm of his land had been forced to reach beyond pride and isolation. The woman who had spent years drifting, careful never to depend on anyone, had found herself calling for someone's voice in the dark. Now, as the sun rose higher, their eyes met, truly met, for the first time in full light. And yet, they both understood that what bound them had little to do with what they saw. Sarah's gaze lingered on the lines weathering Elias's face, the faint scar near his temple, the calloused strength in his hands. These details might once have intimidated her, the marks of a man hardened by loss and labor, but now she saw them differently. They were proof of survival, the map of a life that had endured. Elias, in turn, looked at Sarah and saw not just a stranger rescued from the storm, but a woman of quiet steel and unspoken grace. He remembered the tremor in her voice when she'd called his name through the wind, the courage it had taken to keep moving when sight and sound had failed her. He realized that her strength had not come from the world's approval, but from a will that refused to break. Between them, words were scarce, but the silence spoke volumes. They both understood something now that had eluded them for years. That connection is not found in ease, but in endurance. Love, real love, is not built on smooth days and gentle skies. It is forged in storms, when everything else falls away and only the truth of one's soul remains. In that truth, they had found each other. Over the next few days, as they traveled together toward the nearest settlement, their companionship deepened in quiet, unspoken ways. There was no need for grand gestures. Elias would steady her when the path grew steep. Sarah would hum softly in the evenings, filling the air with warmth that words could not. They shared food, laughter, and silences, and somehow, each moment felt like another step toward something larger than themselves. When they reached the edge of civilization, a small, wind-worn town nestled against the foothills, the noise and bustle felt almost foreign. People hurried about their business, speaking of weather, prices, and news. Yet, to Elias and Sarah, it all seemed shallow. The storm had changed them. They had lived in a world reduced to its barest elements, fear, hope, trust, and had discovered that even in blindness, there was clarity. Sarah turned to Elias before they parted to rest. "You know," she said softly, "I used to think seeing meant understanding. But in the storm, I couldn't see a thing, and yet I saw you more clearly than I ever could in the daylight." Elias nodded slowly, his eyes soft. "Maybe that's what it takes," he murmured. "Losing sight, so we can finally see what matters." The words lingered between them, carried off by the same wind that had once threatened to destroy them. As they walked together into the rising sun, hand in hand, the storm's memory remained not as a terror, but as a teacher. It had shown them that love, like the frontier, was not tamed by comfort or vision, but revealed in the struggle to endure. For in the blindness of the storm, they had found their truest sight, the kind that does not fade with daylight, but lives forever in the heart. Sometimes it is only when the world falls away, when all that's left is trust, fear, and a voice calling through the wind, that we finally see the path to love. And for Elias and Sarah, that path began not in the calm, but beyond the dust. Months had passed since the storm, the one that had blinded, tested, and ultimately bound Elias and Sarah together. The memory of that day lingered not as a haunting, but as a quiet pulse beneath everything they did. The dust, the fear, the desperate calls through the wind, all of it had become part of their story, the foundation upon which something lasting had begun to grow. Now, the same wild frontier that had once seemed cruel and indifferent stretched before them, no longer a place of isolation but of belonging. The land was still rugged, the red cliffs jagged against a wide, endless sky, but Elias's ranch, once silent and hollow, now echoed with the subtle sounds of life, the rhythmic clatter of hooves, the soft hum of Sarah's voice as she hung linens in the dry wind, the laughter of children from the nearby town who visited to see her new little garden, miraculously blooming in the stubborn soil. For the first time in years, Elias's home felt alive. The transformation had been gradual. After the storm, Sarah had chosen to stay, at first to recover, then to help repair the damage to his ranch. But what began as shared labor became shared life. Together they rebuilt fences, mended roofs, and cleared the fields. In the process, they discovered the easy rhythm of partnership, the kind that doesn't need constant words, only trust. Elias had always been a man of few sentences, but Sarah never demanded them. She learned to read him in gestures, the way he'd hand her his coat when the air cooled, the way his gaze softened when she spoke about books or the stars. He, in turn, began to speak in ways he hadn't in years, not of work or weather, but of dreams. At dusk, they would sit together on the porch, the horizon glowing with the last light of day. The wind would sweep across the plains, carrying the scent of sage and dust, and Sarah would rest her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever think about that day?" she'd ask sometimes. "Every time the wind picks up," Elias would admit. "But I don't fear it anymore." "Why?" "Because it brought you to me." There was no grand romance in their days, no ballrooms or fine words, but there was steadfastness. The quiet kind of love that takes root in hard ground and blooms anyway. Sarah often thought about how easily things might have gone differently. How, if the storm hadn't struck, she might have continued her drifting life, moving from place to place, never letting anyone close. And Elias, he might have stayed buried in the silence of his ranch, haunted by what he'd lost, too afraid to hope again. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The storm had stripped away everything unnecessary, their fears, their walls, their excuses, and left only the truth, that love, to endure, must be tested. One afternoon, as they worked side by side repairing a corral fence, the wind began to rise again, playful this time, tossing Sarah's hair across her face. She looked up, squinting toward the horizon where the sky darkened just slightly, a reminder of the past. Elias noticed her hesitation and smiled. "It's just wind," he said gently. "We've weathered worse." She smiled back, realizing he was right, not just about the weather, but about life itself. They had built something no storm could tear down, not because it was perfect, but because it was earned out by the time the sun dipped low. The fence was mended, the air was still, and Sarah walked up the porch steps beside Elias. She glanced out at the land, vast, untamed but beautiful. "This place," she said softly, "it's not just a home, is it?" "It's proof." "Proof of what?" Elias asked, leaning against the railing. "That love doesn't have to start with comfort. It can begin in the hardest places and still grow strong." He nodded, reaching for her hand. "Like us." "Like us," she echoed Dot as the last light of day slipped beneath the mountains. The two stood together in the quiet, their silhouettes framed against the golden sky. The land around them was scarred but thriving, a perfect reflection of their hearts, because love, they had learned, wasn't about finding safety from the storm. It was about finding someone to weather it with, someone who, when the dust settles, still stands beside you, seeing not the wreckage, but the beauty of what's been rebuilt. And in that wild, untamed corner of the frontier, Elias and Sarah had done exactly that. They hadn't just survived the storm. They had built a life from its ashes, steady, enduring, and as infinite as the horizon stretching before them.